Welcome to Midnight Grove, where stories of love, loss, and renewal come alive. Tonight's heartfelt tale, Max and the Seasons of Love, takes us on a journey through the unbreakable bond between a woman and her loyal dog, Max. From rescue to companionship, and from grief to healing, this story reminds us of the beauty found in every chapter of life. Max and the Seasons of Love. Chapter 1. Found in the Rain. The rain was relentless that night, a torrential downpour that turned the quiet suburban streets into glistening rivers. Alice tightened her hood against the wind, her shoes squelching with every step. She'd cursed her decision to walk home from her shift at the diner, even though it had seemed like a good idea when the skies were still clear. Now her fingers were numb, and the cold seeped through her jacket. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Alice shivered, glancing down at the flickering glow of her phone. The screen displayed a blurry map that was practically useless in the rain. She wasn't far from home, but each block felt like a mile in weather like this. She was passing an old, overgrown lot when a faint sound stopped her. It was a whimper, barely audible over the rain. Alice froze, straining her ears. Another whimper came, then a bark, a weak, desperate sound. Her heart sank. The lot was an eerie place, even on sunny days, filled with scraggly bushes and rusted metal junk left to rot. She hesitated at the edge, the rain drenching her as she peered into the darkness. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. Another bark answered, this one sharper. Alice didn't think twice. She pushed her way through the tangled bushes, wincing as the wet branches scratched her hands and face. It didn't take long to find him. Huddled under the broken frame of an old car was a dog, small, soaked, and trembling. His matted fur clung to his thin frame, and his dark eyes glistened with fear. When she crouched down, he growled weakly, baring his teeth. "Hey, it's okay," Alice said softly, her voice cutting through the storm. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog didn't move, his growl turning into a pitiful whine. Alice could see the exhaustion in his body, the way he shivered uncontrollably in the cold. She reached out slowly, letting him sniff her hand. For a moment she thought he might bite, but then he licked her fingers, his movements hesitant. "There you go," she murmured, her heart breaking at how frail he looked. Without thinking, she slipped off her jacket and wrapped it around him. He flinched at first, but didn't resist as she scooped him into her arms. He was heavier than he looked, and Alice staggered slightly under his weight. "Let's get you out of here," she said, cradling him close. Alice's apartment was a tiny one-bedroom on the third floor of an old building, but it was warm and dry. She laid the dog on the couch, carefully unwrapping him from her jacket. He whimpered again, curling into a tight ball as she grabbed a towel from the bathroom. "You've had a rough night, huh?" she said, drying him off as gently as she could. His fur was a mix of brown and white, though it was hard to tell with all the mud and grime. He didn't answer, of course, but he looked at her with those dark eyes, his expression a mix of fear and gratitude. Alice fetched a bowl of water and placed it in front of him. He lapped it up greedily, his thin sides heaving with the effort. "You must be starving," she said, opening her fridge. There wasn't much, just some leftover chicken and a few slices of bread. She shredded the chicken into small pieces and placed it in another bowl, setting it beside him. The dog hesitated, sniffing the food cautiously before devouring it in seconds. "Poor guy," Alice murmured, stroking his head. His ears twitched, but he didn't pull away. She sat with him for a while, listening to the rain pounding against the windows. The storm outside was fierce, but inside the apartment felt calm. The dog had stopped trembling, his breathing steadier now as he rested his head on the towel she'd spread over the couch. "What am I going to do with you?" Alice wondered aloud. She knew she couldn't keep him. Her landlord had a strict no pets policy, and her budget barely covered her own expenses, but the thought of leaving him out in the rain again made her stomach twist. For now she decided he could stay the night. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a world that smelled fresh and clean. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the dog stirred as Alice set a plate of toast on the counter. "Morning, buddy," she said, kneeling beside him. He yawned, his pink tongue curling as he stretched his legs. He looked better in the daylight, though still far too thin. His fur had dried into soft, fluffy patches, and his eyes were brighter now. "Are you hungry again?" she asked, offering him another piece of chicken. This time he wagged his tail just a little, but it was enough to make Alice smile. She spent the morning calling around to local shelters, but none of them had space. One receptionist suggested the pound, but Alice dismissed the idea immediately. She couldn't bear the thought of this sweet dog ending up in a cage. "What am I going to do with you?" she said again, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him. He wagged his tail again, this time more enthusiastically. Alice sighed, running a hand through her hair. She couldn't keep him, not permanently, but maybe, just maybe, she could make room for him until she found him a proper home. "All right," she said, scratching behind his ears. "You can stay, but just until we figure something out, okay?" The dog licked her hand, his tail thumping against the couch. Alice laughed, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Welcome home, Max," she said. Max. The name came to her suddenly, as if it had been waiting for him all along. That night, as Max curled up at the foot of her bed, Alice felt a strange sense of contentment. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. The quiet bond between them had already begun to form, and though she didn't realize it yet, Max was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Chapter 2: A Temporary Home. Alice had no intention of keeping Max, but by the end of the first week, she couldn't imagine her apartment without him. It wasn't like she had much choice at first. The local shelters had politely told her the same thing. "We're at capacity." The few that weren't completely full had rules she didn't like, rules about euthanizing animals that weren't adopted quickly. She shuddered at the thought. So for now, Max stayed. He quickly made himself at home, which surprised Alice. On the first day, he'd been nervous, shying away from sudden movements and barking softly at shadows that flickered on the walls. But by the third day, he was following her from room to room, his tail wagging whenever she so much as looked at him. "You're settling in a little too fast for someone who isn't staying," she teased one morning as she set a bowl of scrambled eggs on the floor. Max wagged his tail furiously, devouring the eggs in seconds. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and Alice checked it with a sigh. It was her landlord, Mrs. Pearson, who had an uncanny knack for appearing whenever Alice broke one of her many strict rules. "Any chance you can swing by my office this afternoon? Need to go over the lease renewal," the text read. Alice glanced at Max, who had flopped onto the couch and was gnawing on the corner of a throw pillow. "This is going to be a problem," she muttered. She loved her apartment. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with peeling paint and a kitchen so small she could barely turn around in it. But it was hers. Mrs. Pearson was picky, though, and a dog would definitely not make the cut. Alice grabbed her phone and typed out a quick reply. Sure, I'll stop by after work. She put the phone down and stared at Max. He stared back, his tongue lolling out of his mouth. You're going to have to behave while I'm gone, she said. No barking, no chewing anything valuable, and absolutely no peeing on the floor. Max tilted his head as if considering her request. I mean it, Alice said, pointing at him. He wagged his tail. By the time she returned home that evening, Alice was bracing herself for disaster. She opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find her furniture shredded and the trash can tipped over. But Max greeted her with a happy bark, his tail thumping against the wall. The apartment was spotless. Good boy, Alice said, dropping her bag and scratching behind his ears. He licked her hand enthusiastically, clearly proud of himself. As she fixed herself a quick dinner, her mind wandered to the meeting with Mrs. Pearson. It had gone smoothly enough, no mention of pets, thankfully, but it had left her feeling uneasy. How long could she realistically keep Max without getting caught? Alice sat on the couch, her plate balanced on her knees, and watched as Max curled up at her feet. He was already snoring softly, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She hated the thought of giving him up. The next morning, Alice decided to take Max for a walk. He needed the exercise, and she figured it would do her some good too. The neighborhood was quiet at this time of day, the sidewalks lined with neatly trimmed hedges and rows of mailboxes. Max trotted beside her, his nose twitching as he sniffed every tree and lamppost they passed. He was clearly delighted by this new world, his tail wagging with every new scent he discovered. Alice couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. You act like you've never been on a walk before, she said, tugging gently at the leash when he stopped to investigate a pile of leaves. Max looked up at her, his eyes sparkling before bounding forward again. His energy was infectious, and Alice found herself enjoying the walk far more than she had expected. As they turned a corner, Alice noticed a small park up ahead. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass with a few benches and a lone swing set, but it was empty, and the air smelled fresh after last night's rain. She decided to take a break, leading Max toward one of the benches. Okay, buddy, let's rest for a bit, she said, sitting down. Max seemed to understand. He flopped onto the grass beside her, his tongue lolling out as he panted happily. Alice leaned back, letting the sunlight warm her face. It was peaceful here, the kind of moment she hadn't realized she needed. But her mind kept circling back to the same question. What was she going to do about Max? Max's past. Over the next few weeks, Alice tried to piece together what little she could about Max's past. There were no tags on his collar, just a frayed strip of leather that seemed too worn to be useful anymore. She had taken him to a nearby vet for a checkup, hoping they might recognize him, but no microchip had been found. The vet had guessed Max to be around 5 years old, a mix of breeds with no clear dominant traits. He's in surprisingly good health for a stray, the vet had said, scratching Max behind the ears. You're lucky you found him when you did. A few more nights out in that storm and he might not have made it. The thought had haunted Alice ever since. She wondered how long Max had been out there, wandering the streets alone. Had someone abandoned him? Had he gotten lost? The idea of him being left behind on purpose made her stomach turn. Who left you out there? She asked him one evening as they sat on the couch. Max didn't answer, of course. He just wagged his tail, resting his head on her lap. Whoever it was, they're idiots, Alice said softly, stroking his fur. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. The words surprised her as they left her mouth, but she didn't take them back. The warning, Despite the growing bond between them, Alice's nerves were constantly on edge. She was terrified that Mrs. Pearson would discover Max and evict her. She took precautions, keeping Max quiet during the day, sneaking him out for walks early in the morning or late at night, and cleaning obsessively to make sure there was no trace of fur in the hallways. But it wasn't enough to calm her anxiety. Her fears came to a head one afternoon when she returned home to find a note taped to her door. Reminder: no pets allowed on the premises. Violations will result in fines and possible eviction. Alice's heart sank. She crumpled the note in her fist, her mind racing. Had someone seen her walking Max or heard him barking? She glanced down the hallway, half expecting Mrs. Pearson to appear around the corner. Inside the apartment, Max greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, oblivious to the turmoil in her head. "What are we gonna do, buddy?" she whispered, sinking onto the couch. Max climbed up beside her, resting his head on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it brought tears to Alice's eyes. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "I'm not giving you up," she said firmly, the words muffled but resolute. "No matter what. A glimmer of hope." That night, Alice stayed up late, scrolling through online forums and social media pages for advice. She read stories of people hiding pets from landlords, tips on how to avoid detection, and even recommendations for pet-friendly apartments. But none of the solutions seemed realistic. As she clicked through another page of search results, a listing caught her eye. Part-time job available at Helping Paws Shelter. Must love animals. Alice's heart skipped a beat. She clicked on the link, scanning the details. The shelter was small, only a few blocks away, and the hours were flexible. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it was a start. An opportunity to meet people who might know how to help Max. Without hesitation, she sent an application. Max's new routine. Over the next week, Alice and Max fell into a routine. Mornings were spent at the park, where Max had discovered a love for chasing squirrels, though he never caught them. Afternoons were quieter, with Max napping on the couch while Alice worked her shifts at the diner. But the evenings were their favorite. Alice would come home exhausted from the day, and Max would greet her at the door with a wagging tail and an excited bark. One night, as they sat on the floor playing tug-of-war with an old sock, Alice realized how much Max had changed her life. "Maybe you were meant to find me," she said, smiling as Max pulled the sock from her hands. Max barked in agreement, his tail wagging furiously. Alice laughed, pulling him into a hug. For the first time in years, she felt like everything was going to be okay. But she had no idea how much Max's presence would truly change her life, or the challenges they would face together. Chapter 3: Building Trust. Alice woke up to the sound of a low, rhythmic thumping. It took her a moment to realize what it was: Max's tail wagging against the floor. She opened her eyes to find him sitting at the foot of her bed, his tongue hanging out as he watched her with an expression of pure joy. "Good morning, sunshine," she said groggily, stretching. Max barked softly, standing up and wagging his tail even harder. "I know," she said, swinging her legs off the bed. "You're way too happy in the mornings." Max followed her to the kitchen, his paws clicking against the linoleum as he walked. Alice grabbed his food bowl and scooped in the last of the kibble she'd bought 2 weeks ago. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover the bottom of the bowl, but Max seemed content, wolfing it down in seconds. "We're gonna need to get you some more food today," Alice said, rinsing out his bowl. "You're eating me out of house and home, you know that?" Max barked in response, his tail thumping against the cabinet. As the weeks passed, Alice and Max fell into a rhythm. She started her part-time job at the Helping Paws shelter, which quickly became her second home. The small, cozy space was filled with the sounds of barking dogs and purring cats, and the staff were a close-knit group who welcomed Alice with open arms. Max was a constant source of joy, but he wasn't without his quirks. He was fiercely loyal, refusing to let Alice out of his sight for more than a few minutes. If she left the room, he would follow her. If she closed a door, he would sit outside and whine softly until she opened it again. "You've got a bit of separation anxiety, don't you?" she said one afternoon as Max lay at her feet while she worked on her laptop. Max thumped his tail in agreement, resting his head on her knee. Alice didn't mind. In fact, she found his devotion comforting. It had been a long time since anyone or anything had relied on her so completely. A new challenge. One Saturday morning, Alice decided to take Max to the dog park. She'd been hesitant about it at first, worried that he might not get along with the other dogs, but the shelter staff had encouraged her to give it a try. Socialization is important, Clara, one of the shelter volunteers, had said. It'll help him build confidence. The dog park was busier than Alice expected. Dozens of dogs ran around in a fenced-in area, chasing balls and wrestling in the grass. Owners stood in small groups, chatting and laughing as they watched their pets play. Max froze as soon as they entered the gate. His tail, which had been wagging moments ago, drooped between his legs, and he pressed himself against Alice's side. "It's okay, buddy," she said, kneeling beside him. "They're just other dogs. You've seen dogs before." Max didn't budge. His ears flattened against his head and he let out a low whine. Alice's heart sank. She knew Max's fear was rooted in his past, in whatever had happened to him before she found him. "All right," she said softly. "We'll take it slow." She led Max to a quieter corner of the park, away from the chaos. He sat at her feet, his body tense as he watched the other dogs from a distance. Alice stayed with him for over an hour, talking to him in soothing tones and offering him treats whenever he showed interest in the activity around him. Slowly but surely, Max began to relax. His ears perked up and his tail gave a tentative wag. "That's my boy," Alice said, scratching behind his ears. By the time they left, Max was walking with his head held a little higher, his steps more confident. Unpacking the past. That evening, Alice sat on the couch with Max curled up beside her. She couldn't stop thinking about how scared he'd been at the park, how tightly he'd clung to her side. "What happened to you, Max?" she murmured, stroking his fur. "Why are you so afraid?" Max let out a soft sigh, his eyes closing as he leaned into her touch. Alice had learned bits and pieces about trauma in animals from her time at the shelter. Some dogs were abandoned, others abused or neglected. It was impossible to know for sure what Max had been through, but Alice had a sinking feeling that it hadn't been good. She made a silent vow to give him the love and security he deserved, no matter how long it took. A breakthrough. The following week, Alice decided to take Max back to the dog park. This time she brought a tennis ball, hoping it might coax him out of his shell. At first, Max seemed hesitant again, sticking close to Alice as they entered the gate. But as soon as she pulled out the ball, his ears perked up. "Wanna play?" she asked, holding the ball in front of him. Max barked, his tail wagging furiously. Alice laughed, throwing the ball across the field. Max took off after it, his legs a blur as he raced to catch it. For the first time, he seemed completely at ease, his fear replaced by pure, unfiltered joy. Other dogs joined in, chasing Max as he brought the ball back to Alice. She threw it again, and the cycle repeated, each throw building his confidence a little more. By the time they left the park, Max was walking with a spring in his step, his tail held high. "You're a different dog, aren't you?" Alice said, smiling as they made their way home. Max barked as if to say, "I'm getting there." The warning signs. Life settled into a routine after that. Max grew braver with each passing day, and Alice felt her bond with him deepening. But one evening, as they were playing tug-of-war in the living room, Alice noticed something strange. Max dropped the rope suddenly, letting out a sharp yelp. He sat down heavily, licking his paw as if something had hurt him. "Hey, what's wrong?" Alice asked, kneeling beside him. Max didn't respond, but his breathing was shallow and his tail was tucked tightly between his legs. Alice inspected his paw, but she didn't see anything unusual. Still, something about the way he was acting set off alarm bells in her mind. "So I think we need to get you checked out," she said softly, stroking his head. Max wagged his tail weakly, his eyes filled with trust. The next morning, Alice called the vet and scheduled an appointment. She tried to push down the knot of anxiety in her stomach, but it was hard to ignore. Max had been through so much already. The thought of something being seriously wrong with him was almost too much to bear. As they sat together on the couch that night, Alice wrapped her arms around Max and whispered, "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I promise." Max licked her face, his tail wagging gently. In that moment, Alice realized just how much he had come to mean to her. He wasn't just a dog, he was family. Chapter 4, Facing the Unknown. The waiting room at the vet's office was quieter than Alice had expected. The faint hum of a fish tank filled the air, and the occasional soft bark echoed from the exam rooms. Max sat pressed against her legs, his head resting on her knee. His trustful eyes looked up at her as if to say, "It's okay, we'll get through this." Alice stroked his head absent-mindedly, her thoughts racing. She hated how nervous she felt, but Max's yelp the other night had been unlike anything she'd heard from him before. It was sharp, pained, and entirely out of character. "Max?" the vet's assistant called from the counter. Alice stood, gripping Max's leash a little tighter as they walked to the exam room. Max was reluctant at first, pulling back slightly, but a reassuring pat from Alice got him moving. Dr. Ramirez, the vet, was a kind-faced woman in her early 50s, with soft grey hair tied back in a ponytail. She greeted Max warmly, kneeling down to let him sniff her hand. Max wagged his tail hesitantly before giving her fingers a tentative lick. "Good boy," Dr. Ramirez said with a smile. She stood and turned to Alice. "So what seems to be the problem?" Alice explained everything. The yelp, the sudden stop during their game, and Max's unusual quietness afterward. "He seemed fine the next day," Alice said, "but I just have this gut feeling something's not right." Dr. Ramirez nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know him better than anyone. Let's take a look." The examination. Max was surprisingly cooperative as Dr. Ramirez examined him, though his eyes never left Alice. She stayed close, murmuring soft reassurances while the vet checked his paws, joints, and overall body. When Dr. Ramirez gently pressed along Max's back legs, he flinched, letting out a soft whine. "There it is," Dr. Ramirez said, her tone more serious now. "It seems like there's some discomfort in his hind leg." Alice's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "It could be a few things," Dr. Ramirez replied. A strain, arthritis, or even something more serious like hip dysplasia. We'll need to do some x-rays to be sure. Alice nodded, her throat dry. Okay, let's do it. Max looked up at her as if sensing her worry. She knelt down and kissed his head, whispering, "You're gonna be okay, buddy." The wait for the x-rays was agonizing. Alice sat in the same waiting room as before, clutching her phone but unable to focus on anything. She kept replaying Dr. Ramirez's words in her head, her heart sinking at the possibilities. She had never realized how much Max had become her anchor. He wasn't just a dog, he was her partner in life, her constant through every uncertainty. The thought of him being in pain or sick was unbearable. Finally, the assistant called her back to the exam room. The diagnosis. Dr. Ramirez gestured for Alice to sit down as she placed the x-rays on the light board. "There's no easy way to say this," she began gently. "The x-rays show early signs of degenerative joint disease, commonly known as arthritis. It's particularly common in older dogs or those who've had a rough start in life, like Max likely did." Alice felt her chest tighten. Is it going to get worse?" Dr. Ramirez nodded. "It's a progressive condition, but it can be managed with the right care. Max is still young, so we have an opportunity to help slow it down and keep him comfortable for as long as possible." She explained a treatment plan: weight management, joint supplements, pain medications, and low-impact exercises like swimming. "He might not be able to do as much running or jumping as he used to," Dr. Ramirez said, "but he can still live a happy, fulfilling life." Alice nodded, her mind swirling with questions. What about his past? Could what happened to him before I found him have caused this? "It's hard to say," Dr. Ramirez replied, "but stress, malnutrition, and lack of proper care can definitely exacerbate conditions like this. Max's body may have endured more than we'll ever know." Alice looked down at Max, who was lying quietly on the exam table. His eyes met hers and she felt a wave of determination. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said firmly, adjusting to a new routine. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. Alice researched everything she could about canine arthritis, buying special food and supplements that promised to support joint health. She even ordered a memory foam dog bed for Max, something soft to ease the strain on his body. She also cut back on their long walks and started taking him to the local lake for swimming. At first, Max was hesitant, pawing nervously at the water's edge. But with Alice's encouragement and a few thrown tennis balls, he soon discovered a love for paddling through the cool, gentle waves. "You're a natural," Alice said one afternoon as Max splashed toward her, the ball clamped triumphantly in his jaws. She couldn't help but smile at how happy he looked, his tail wagging as he swam back to shore. An unexpected visitor. One evening, Alice was finishing up dinner when her phone buzzed. It was Clara, her co-worker from the shelter. "Hey Alice, are you home?" Clara asked. "Yeah, why?" "I'm outside. I've got something I think you need to see." Curious, Alice opened the door to find Clara standing on the porch with a small scruffy puppy cradled in her arms. The pup had floppy ears and big, soulful eyes that reminded Alice of Max. "What?" Alice began. Clara smiled. "I know you've got your hands full with Max, but this little guy just came into the shelter. He was found in a pretty rough state. Reminded me of Max when you first brought him in. I thought, well, maybe Max could use a friend." Alice glanced down at Max, who was sitting at her feet, his ears perked up as he sniffed the air. The puppy squirmed in Clara's arms, letting out a tiny bark. "Oh no," Alice said with a laugh. "I already know where this is going." A bond forged in trust. It didn't take long for Alice to decide. She named the puppy Charlie, and while he was a bundle of energy that often left her exhausted, he quickly became part of their little family. Max took to Charlie immediately, his calm, steady presence balancing out the puppy's exuberance. Watching them together, Alice realized how far Max had come, from a scared, trembling stray to a confident, happy dog who could teach a younger one the meaning of trust. Her apartment felt fuller now, bursting with life and love. And though Max's arthritis required constant care, Alice found herself embracing the challenges, grateful for every moment they had together. One evening, as the three of them curled up on the couch, Alice whispered, "You saved me as much as I saved you, Max. Don't ever forget that." Max licked her hand, his eyes shining with a love that needed no words. Chapter 5. The Healing Process. Life had settled into a new rhythm for Alice, Max, and the ever-energetic Charlie. Mornings began with coffee for Alice, a quick stroll for Charlie to burn off his endless energy, and a slow, steady walk for Max to loosen his stiff joints. Afternoons were split between Alice's shifts at the shelter and quiet playtime at the park, where Max dozed in the sun while Charlie chased every moving thing he could find. Alice had grown used to managing Max's condition. The vet-prescribed supplements were working wonders, and Alice had learned how to gently massage his hips when his movements became stiff. She'd even found a local hydrotherapy center for dogs, where Max paddled happily in warm water under a therapist's watchful eye. "I've never met a dog who smiles so much," the therapist had said during their last visit, watching Max wag his tail in the pool. Alice smiled proudly. He's got a lot to smile about these days. But deep down, Alice knew their time together wouldn't last forever. Max's arthritis was manageable now, but the condition was progressive. Each good day was a gift, and she savored them with a quiet intensity. A twist in the routine. One chilly autumn morning, Alice woke to find Max moving slower than usual. He wasn't limping exactly, but his steps were more careful, his tail drooping in a way that made her heart sink. "Max," she said, crouching beside him. "You okay, buddy?" Max wagged his tail weakly, his eyes meeting hers with a look that seemed to say, "I'm trying." Alice cancelled her plans for the day, staying home to monitor him. She kept the apartment quiet and warm, letting Max rest on his favorite spot on the couch, while Charlie snuggled beside him. By the evening, he seemed a little better, wagging his tail with more enthusiasm when Alice sat down to stroke his fur. But the scare lingered in her mind. The next day, she called Dr. Ramirez for advice. "It's not unusual for arthritis to flare up with the changing seasons," the vet explained. "Colder weather can make things worse. Keep him warm, limit his activity, and bring him in if it gets worse." Alice nodded, jotting down notes even though she already knew the routine by heart. "I just hate seeing him like this," she admitted. "You're doing everything right, Alice," Dr. Ramirez said gently. "Max is lucky to have you." Charlie steps up. Over the following weeks, Charlie seemed to sense Max's struggles. The once rowdy puppy who never missed a chance to chew on Max's ears or steal his favorite toys suddenly became gentler. He stayed close to Max, often lying beside him and resting his head on Max's shoulder. Alice watched in amazement as Charlie started adapting his behavior. When Max hesitated at the top of the stairs, Charlie would bark softly and nudge him as if to say, "Take your time. I've got your back." "You're a good boy, Charlie," Alice said one evening as she watched them from the couch. "Max must be rubbing off on you." Charlie wagged his tail and barked, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. Max, for his part, seemed to take comfort in Charlie's presence. Though his energy was limited, he still played with the puppy in short bursts, often wagging his tail as Charlie pounced and rolled across the floor. Watching them together filled Alice with hope. When the first snow of the season arrived, Alice wasn't sure how Max would handle it. Snow had always been one of his favorite things. She still remembered the winter when he'd first discovered it, bounding through the drifts with puppy-like joy. But now, she worried the cold would worsen his arthritis. Still, when Charlie started barking at the door, Max stood up slowly and padded over, his tail wagging with curiosity. "You want to go out there, huh?" Alice asked, smiling at his determination. She bundled both dogs in warm coats she'd bought online. Charlie's was bright red, and Max's was a more subdued navy blue. She grabbed her gloves and hat, then led them outside. The neighborhood was a winter wonderland, the trees and rooftops blanketed in soft white snow. Charlie immediately started bounding through the drifts, barking with glee. Max followed more cautiously, sniffing the air and wagging his tail. Alice tossed a small snowball in Max's direction, and he caught it gently in his mouth before letting it fall. His tail wagged harder, his eyes sparkling with the same joy she remembered from years ago. For the first time in weeks, Max seemed like his old self again. A hard decision, but the good days were bittersweet. As winter deepened, Max's bad days became more frequent. There were mornings when he struggled to get up, his legs trembling under his weight. Alice adjusted his routine, cutting back on walks and carrying him up the stairs when he couldn't manage them on his own. Dr. Ramirez warned her that this was the natural progression of his condition, but the words didn't make it any easier to accept. One snowy afternoon, Alice sat on the floor with Max, stroking his fur as Charlie snoozed beside them. "How do you know when it's time?" she asked softly, her voice breaking. Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with trust. He licked her hand gently as if to say, "You'll know." The thought of losing him was unbearable. Max had been her constant through so many changes, the one thing that made her feel safe and whole. Letting him go felt impossible. But deep down, Alice knew she couldn't let him suffer. A visit to the lake. 1 week later, on a crisp and sunny morning, Alice decided to take Max and Charlie to the lake. It had been months since their last visit, and she wanted to give Max one more chance to paddle in the water he loved so much. She carried Max to the shore, setting him gently on the sand. Charlie barked and bounded into the shallow water, splashing happily as Max watched with wagging tail. Alice tossed a tennis ball into the lake, and Max surprised her by wading in after it. His movements were slow and deliberate, but his determination was undeniable. He retrieved the ball and brought it back to her, his tail wagging proudly. "You're amazing," Alice whispered, tears welling in her eyes. For the rest of the day, they stayed by the lake, soaking in the sunshine and the simple joy of being together. A quiet goodbye. That evening, as Alice tucked Max into his bed, she whispered, "Thank you for everything, Max. You've been the best friend I could have ever asked for." Max licked her hand, his eyes filled with a love that needed no words. Charlie curled up beside him, resting his head on Max's shoulder as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Chapter 6, Letting Go. The days leading up to that morning were some of the longest and hardest Alice had ever experienced. Winter had fully arrived, its cold seeping into every corner of the apartment, and with it came the creeping realization that Max's condition was worsening. He'd been struggling more than usual, his movements slow and careful. His once happy, bounding walks had been reduced to hesitant steps, and though he still wagged his tail when Alice sat beside him, the energy behind it had dimmed. Alice tried to keep him comfortable. She spent hours researching how to ease his pain, reading articles about end-of-life care for dogs, and calling Dr. Ramirez for advice. She cooked for him, added extra blankets to his bed, and gave him all the treats he wanted. But nothing could reverse the inevitable. "Take your time," Dr. Ramirez had said on their last visit. "You'll know when it's time to let him go, and when that time comes, the kindest thing you can do is be there for him." Those words stuck with Alice, haunting her. She didn't feel ready, not even close. How could she ever be ready to say goodbye to the one constant in her life? But it wasn't about her. The morning came like any other. Alice woke to the faint sound of Max's breathing. It was softer than it had been in weeks, barely audible over the quiet hum of the radiator. She glanced down at him from her bed, her chest tightening at the sight. He was curled up in his usual spot beside her bed, his head resting on a blanket she'd placed there the night before. His body rose and fell slowly, each breath labored but steady. "Good morning, Max," Alice whispered, sliding off the bed and kneeling beside him. Max's tail wagged faintly, the effort visible in his eyes. He tried to lift his head, but it was too much. Alice stroked his fur gently, her voice trembling. "You're so strong," she murmured, leaning close. "You've always been so strong." Charlie appeared in the doorway, his head tilted as he watched. The younger dog had been quieter these past few days, as if he could sense the change in the air. He walked over and nuzzled Max's side, lying down beside him. Alice sat with them for a while, the three of them wrapped in the stillness of the morning. Outside, the world carried on, the muffled sound of traffic, the occasional bark from a neighbor's dog. But inside the apartment, time seemed to stand still. When Alice finally called the vet, her hands shook as she dialed the number. She could barely get the words out, her voice breaking as she explained that it was time. Dr. Ramirez's response was kind and steady. "Bring him in when you're ready. We'll be here for you." The thought of leaving the apartment with Max felt impossible. This was his home, his sanctuary, the place where he'd learned to trust again. But Alice knew she couldn't let him suffer, not after everything he'd given her. She carefully wrapped him in his favorite blanket, the soft one with the faded stars he'd claimed as his own. Max barely moved, but his tail wagged faintly as Alice lifted him into her arms. "You're such a good boy," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. Charlie followed close behind as they made their way to the car. He jumped into the back seat without hesitation, curling up beside Max as if to reassure him that he wasn't alone. Alice drove slowly, the silence in the car broken only by the hum of the engine and the soft sound of Max's breathing. The vet's office was quiet when they arrived, the usual bustle of the waiting room replaced with a calm stillness. A receptionist greeted Alice with a kind smile and directed her to a private room where Dr. Ramirez was waiting. The room was warm and inviting, with a cushioned table in the center and a plush rug beneath it. Alice set Max down carefully, her hands lingering on his fur as he settled onto the blanket. "Take as much time as you need," Dr. Ramirez said softly. "There's no rush." Alice nodded, tears streaming down her face as she sat beside Max. Charlie stayed close, his head resting on Alice's lap as she stroked Max's side. "You've been with me through everything," Alice whispered, her voice shaking. You've been my best friend, my family, my anchor. I don't know what I'll do without you, Max." Max blinked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a trust that made her heart ache. He licked her hand gently, his tail wagging just once. Alice leaned down, pressing her forehead to his. "Thank you," she said, her tears falling onto his fur. "Thank you for loving me, for staying with me, for everything." When the time came, Dr. Ramirez walked Alice through the process, her voice calm and steady. Max rested peacefully on the table, his head cradled in Alice's hands. Alice held him close, whispering to him as the injection was administered. "You're such a good boy," she said, her voice breaking. "I love you so much." Max's breathing slowed, then stopped. The room fell silent, but the love Alice felt for him was louder than ever. Charlie let out a soft whine, pressing himself against Alice as she cried. Dr. Ramirez gave Alice all the time she needed, stepping out of the room and leaving her alone with Max. Alice stayed for what felt like hours, stroking Max's fur and holding his paw. When she finally stood to leave, she kissed his forehead one last time. "Goodbye, Max," she whispered. "I'll love you forever." The drive home was quiet. Charlie sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on Alice's arm. The apartment felt unbearably empty when they returned, the absence of Max like a weight pressing down on every corner. Alice sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Charlie climbed up beside her, licking her cheek gently. "We'll get through this," Alice said softly, wrapping her arms around Charlie. "We'll get through this together." The pain was sharp, but underneath it was the quiet gratitude of having known a love like Max's. Chapter 7: Grief and Gratitude. The emptiness Max left behind was immediate, tangible and all-consuming. For days, Alice walked through her apartment as though in a fog. The absence of Max's quiet, steady presence was everywhere. His bed in the corner of the living room, the leash by the door, even the small dent in the couch where he always slept, all of it served as constant reminders of what she'd lost. Charlie seemed to notice too. The playful, bouncy puppy that had once filled the apartment with energy now followed Alice silently from room to room. He no longer pounced on her feet when she came home or tugged at Max's old blanket for attention. Instead, he would sit by the couch and stare at the empty spot where Max used to sleep. Alice tried to put on a brave face for Charlie's sake, but the weight of her grief was impossible to hide. She found herself crying at random times while making breakfast, folding laundry, or simply sitting at her desk. Each tear felt like a drop in an endless ocean of loss. The first week. The first week without Max was the hardest. Alice kept expecting to hear the soft thud of his tail against the floor whenever she walked into a room. She caught herself reaching for 2 bowls instead of 1 at mealtime, and opening the back door out of habit, as if Max would appear, wagging his tail and ready for a walk. One morning, as she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, she spotted Max's leash hanging on the hook by the door. The sight of it hit her like a wave, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Charlie padded over, resting his head on her lap. He let out a low whine, and Alice reached down to scratch behind his ears. "I miss him so much," she whispered, her voice trembling. Charlie wagged his tail faintly, his eyes full of quiet understanding. Alice knew she wasn't the only one grieving. Rediscovering routine. As the days turned into weeks, Alice slowly began to rebuild her routine. She started taking Charlie to the dog park again, hoping the fresh air and familiar sights would lift both their spirits. At first, Charlie seemed hesitant, sticking close to her side and glancing around as if searching for Max. But little by little, his playful nature began to return. He started chasing tennis balls again, barking at squirrels and bounding through the grass with renewed energy. Watching him brought a bittersweet smile to Alice's face. "You're such a good boy," she said one afternoon, kneeling down to hug him. "Max would be proud of you." Charlie barked happily, wagging his tail as he licked her face. Memories and healing. One rainy evening, Alice was sorting through a box of old papers when she came across an album she hadn't opened in years. It was the one she'd started the day she brought Max home, filled with photos documenting every stage of their life together. She flipped through the pages slowly, her heart aching with every memory. There was a photo of Max on his first day at the apartment, curled up on the couch with her jacket draped over him. Another showed him splashing in the lake, his fur dripping wet as he chased a tennis ball. She paused on a picture of Max and Charlie, taken just a few months earlier. Max was lying on his bed looking up at the camera with his usual calm expression, while Charlie sat beside him, his tongue hanging out in a goofy grin. Tears welled in Alice's eyes, but this time they were accompanied by a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Max," she whispered, tracing a finger over his face. "For everything." A letter to Max. That night, unable to sleep, Alice sat down at her desk and began to write. "Dear Max, I don't know if you can hear me, or if this letter will just end up being words on a page, but I need to say this. You saved me in ways I didn't even realize. When I found you that rainy night, I thought I was the one rescuing you, but it was the other way around. You gave me purpose, love, and a sense of belonging I'd been missing for so long. I wish I could have kept you forever. But even though you're not here physically, I know your love is still with me. I see it in Charlie, in the way he looks at me like you used to, and in the memories we made together. You'll always be a part of me, Max. Always. Thank you for being my best friend. I love you. Alice." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the photo album beside her favorite picture of Max. A glimmer of gratitude. Over time, Alice began to focus less on the pain of losing Max and more on the joy he had brought into her life. She thought about the way he'd wag his tail every time she walked through the door, the nights they'd spent cuddled on the couch, and the countless moments of quiet understanding they'd shared. Max had taught her so much about patience, trust, and the power of unconditional love. One evening, as she and Charlie walked along the lake, Alice felt a sense of peace settle over her. The water was calm, reflecting the soft hues of the setting sun, and the air was filled with the gentle rustling of leaves. Charlie barked suddenly, chasing after a bird that had landed nearby. Alice laughed, her heart light for the first time in weeks. She knelt by the water's edge, letting the cool waves lap at her hands. "Thank you, Max," she whispered, "for everything you gave me." Charlie trotted back to her, dropping a stick at her feet. Alice smiled, tossing it into the water. As Charlie splashed after it, she stood and gazed out at the horizon. Life would go on, and though Max was gone, his love would always remain. Chapter 8, A New Beginning. Spring arrived slowly, as if it were hesitant to push winter aside. The mornings were still crisp, but the afternoons grew warmer, sunlight filtering through budding trees. The snow had melted, and the once barren ground was dotted with patches of green, hints of renewal bursting through the frost. For Alice, the changing season brought a sense of clarity she hadn't expected. The loss of Max still lingered in her heart, but the raw pain had begun to ease, replaced by gratitude for the time they had shared. The apartment was quieter without him, but the memories they had created seemed to fill the empty spaces. Charlie, too, had begun to regain his old energy. His puppy-like enthusiasm was back in full force, and he spent his days racing through the apartment, dragging Alice outside for walks and barking happily at every bird, squirrel, and passing car. "You're keeping me on my toes," Alice said one morning as Charlie bounded ahead of her on the trail near the lake. Charlie turned and barked, his tail wagging as if to say, "That's the plan." An unexpected encounter. It was during one of these walks that Alice noticed a small figure darting out from the bushes along the path. Charlie froze, his ears perked and his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. "What is it, boy?" Alice asked, stopping beside him. The figure stepped cautiously into view, and Alice's breath caught. It was a dog, a small scruffy terrier with wiry fur and wide, nervous eyes. The dog looked underweight, its ribs visible beneath its thin coat. It hesitated, watching Alice and Charlie carefully, as though trying to decide if they were a threat. Alice knelt down slowly, extending her hand. "Hey there," she said softly. "It's okay, we won't hurt you." Charlie wagged his tail, taking a step closer. The terrier flinched but didn't run, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. "You're just a baby," Alice murmured, noticing how young the dog looked. After a few tense moments, the terrier crept closer, its small body trembling. It sniffed Alice's hand cautiously before licking her fingers. "There you go," Alice said with a smile. She glanced around, but there was no sign of an owner or a leash. "Are you lost?" she asked, stroking the dog's fur gently. The terrier let out a soft whine, pressing itself against her leg. Alice sighed. She couldn't leave the dog here. It was too small, too vulnerable to survive on its own. "All right," she said, picking the terrier up carefully. "Let's get you somewhere safe." A new chapter. Back at the apartment, Alice set the terrier down on a blanket in the living room. Charlie immediately bounded over, wagging his tail as he sniffed the new arrival. The terrier flinched at first, but relaxed when Charlie licked its face gently. "You're a natural at this," Alice said, smiling at Charlie. She filled a bowl with water and set it down, watching as the terrier drank eagerly. Its small body seemed to sag with relief, and Alice felt her heart ache. "Let's see if we can find your family," she said, pulling out her phone. Alice spent the next few days calling shelters, checking online lost and found pages, and even hanging flyers around the neighborhood. But no one came forward to claim the terrier. It didn't take long for the little dog to settle into its new environment. It followed Charlie everywhere, trotting behind him like a tiny shadow. Charlie, for his part, seemed thrilled to have a new companion, his playful energy rubbing off on the terrier. Alice found herself falling for the scrappy little dog, whose timid nature reminded her so much of Max when she first brought him home. A decision made. After a week, Alice stopped looking for the terrier's owners. "Maybe you were meant to find us," she said one evening as the terrier curled up in her lap, just like Max was. Charlie barked in agreement, wagging his tail as he hopped onto the couch beside them. Alice laughed, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She decided to name the terrier Daisy, finding peace. As the weeks turned into months, Alice realized how much her life had changed. Charlie and Daisy filled the apartment with laughter and energy, their playful antics a constant source of joy. Alice still thought about Max every day. She would catch glimpses of him in the way Charlie tilted his head or the way Daisy curled up on the couch. His memory was everywhere, woven into the fabric of her life. But instead of bringing her pain, Those memories now brought her comfort. One sunny afternoon, Alice took Charlie and Daisy to the lake. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and the trees were lush and green. She stood on the shore, watching as the two dogs chased each other through the shallow waves. Alice closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her. "Thank you, Max," she whispered, "for everything." She opened her eyes and smiled as Daisy barked, splashing toward her with Charlie close behind. The love Max had given her would never fade. It had grown, shaping her into someone stronger, kinder, and more open to the unexpected. And though Max was gone, his legacy lived on in every step she took forward. Thank you for joining us for Max and the Seasons of Love here at Midnight Grove. Alice's journey with Max and the new friends she finds along the way shows us how love can endure even after loss, guiding us toward brighter days. May this story bring you peace and comfort tonight. Sleep well and cherish the bonds that shape your life.